If you enjoy this video, please consider giving a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments section below. This original bedtime story is made possible thanks to Slumberland patrons. If you would like to support this channel, you can find Patreon details in the description and on my channel homepage. So just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep story in the background. And while I tell this sleep story, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or whether it'll be to the spaces between my words. And this sleep story is about Michelle. And Michelle is an astrologer who visits ruins of a palace high up in the Himalayas, which used to be a place where the god Jupiter was worshipped. And she trekked up to this palace, and while climbing the mountains, she could hear the whistling wind. She could feel the coolness of the wind against her cheeks. She could hear the crunching of the snow with each footstep. And yet she continued to climb higher and higher. And as she arrived at the palace, so she opened the entrance to the palace grounds, pushing open a large wooden door. She headed into the palace grounds, closing that wooden door behind her, and was surprised how the walls of the palace managed to block and deflect the wind, making the air so calm, so crisp and still this side of those walls. And she explored this palace. She'd heard that there was a wall with a stone wheel built into it that used to track the planets across the sky, and on a very specific date, the planets would align with the stone wheel, and the secret knowledge of an ancient civilization would be revealed. And so she came here to this palace, knowing that it's approaching the time when the next alignment should occur. And she'd worked for years on finding this palace. And she'd arrived at the palace a week before the alignment was due to occur, to give herself time to make sure that the stone wheel could be found, to make sure that the stone wheel could be fixed up into working condition if needs be. And over the years of searching for this temple, Michelle had studied different texts from different libraries around the world. And she was now here at this palace, camping in the grounds, in a tent high up in the Himalayas, with that cold, crisp, fresh air. And she found the wall with the wheel in. And she fixed up that wheel. And every day while she worked at fixing up the wheel, she worked from first thing in the morning when the sun rose, through to last thing at night when the sun set. And a few days before the alignment was due to take place, Michelle had managed to get that stone wheel fixed and active, and the stone wheel whirred and grinded slowly in its position, as it initially auto-aligned with key stars and planets in the sky. And the wheel was made of rings of stone around a central hub, with each ring moving at a slightly different speed to hold different celestial objects aligned with holes punched through the stone wheel. And on the night the alignment was due to occur, Michelle watched as that stone wheel turned slowly, following those different objects in the night sky, until the full alignment occurred. And for just a moment, beams of light passed through the holes in the stone, amplified by lenses made of crystals placed inside those holes. And all of the beams of light converged at a single point. And Michelle went to that point where all the light was converging and uncovered what was in that location. And as she removed rubble, brushed away at the ground with her hands, clearing away snow, she noticed that there was something that looked like a slightly milky looking crystal cube, and a stand. And it looked like the cube was supposed to be on the stand. So she cleared the area, placed the stand in its position, placed the cube on the stand, and was instantly surprised when she saw that the beam of light from that alignment struck the cube at a single tiny point. And that light that struck the cube illuminated a series of thin lines within the cube. And those thin lines all ended with light dots. And she looked from the front, and she recognized that from the front, the point of light where the beam struck this cube, and the points of light that she could see within the cube seemed to look like the night sky as she could see it. And she looked at that cube from the top, from the left side, from the right side. And she could see the depth of those points of light within the cube, seeing their location. and she recognized that not only was it a map of the night sky from the front, but it seemed to be a 3D map of the night sky within the cube, showing the position of those specific stars in space, not just as a flat representation from one location. And Michelle only had a few minutes of this alignment being active before the stars will have moved out of position and the map would disappear. So she took photographs from the front, from the left, from the right, from above, so that she could analyze it in more detail later. And after the alignment passed, Michelle headed back to her tent, had a campfire in front of the tent, sat at the campfire for a little while looking at those photos, holding that cube and not being able to see any markings within the cube. It just looked like it was a milky colour of crystal all the way through. She tried shining her torch onto the front of the cube, but that didn't make the lines appear inside the cube. She tried using her glasses to create a lens to focus the light into a single point. She tried to aim that point of light at the front of the cube to try to make those lines in the cube appear. No matter how hard she tried and what angles she shone that light at, she couldn't manage to get it to make the lines appear. And so she wondered what was special about the light, about the whole setup. She thought of different ideas that she might test perhaps in the future, like whether perhaps the crystals making up the lenses on the wheel somehow polarized the light. Maybe something about the exact angle that the light struck the cube. Maybe something about the exact size of the point of light that struck the cube. Maybe something about all that made it so that it would illuminate an exact path of imperfections within the cube that created the map. But she couldn't find a way of replicating that now. So she placed that down beside her. She ate some food under the warmth of that campfire before settling down into her tent and drifting and floating so peacefully, so relaxed, asleep. And the next morning, she awoke. She packed all of her belongings away. She gazed down from the temple, down from this palace, over the meadow below, over the forest beyond the meadow, noticing the way the sun early in the morning was reflecting off the wide river that was flowing from the mountains through the meadow and forest. And with everything packed away, into a single large backpack. She put together a hang glider, carefully constructing the hang glider, fixing the frame in place, the material over the frame, stretching that into place, attaching the thin wire from certain points on the frame that attached to certain other points on the frame, spreading tension, removing some of the tension from where the poles stuck together to make the glider more stable and solid. She then left the palace grounds, ran to the edge of the mountain with her backpack on, with the glider in her hands, and leapt from the mountain. The glider started descending before catching an updraft and rising up. She lifted her feet up, popped them into a bag at the back of the glider, a harness around her waist, spreading her weight, using her body weight to carefully steer that glider with the updraft before directing it towards the edge of the river. And while gliding, she enjoyed that peace, calmness, the gentle silence. How slow time seemed while just gliding and drifting in the sky. Incredibly gradually descending, aiming for a specific point near the edge of the river, just in the meadow, towards the forest, before eventually touching down so comfortably, bang on the mark, coming to a stop, unattaching herself from the glider, dismantling that glider, packing it into a bag that attaches to her backpack, before then inflating an inflatable canoe and having two poles that attach together and two paddles that are made with material and some fold-out metal that attach onto the end of the poles to make the oar that she'll use. Placing her things into the canoe, as she moves the canoe just into the water, then climbing into that canoe, smelling the freshness of that water as she pushes with one paddle effortlessly off from the shore, and begins to canoe down the river towards the forest, effortlessly canoeing along with additional speed of the current, the sound of the paddles as they plop into the water, push some of that water back and pull out of the water. Then the paddle on the other side, plopping into the water, pushing the water back, then pulling out of the water. And that feeling of the canoe travelling down the river, bobbing ever so slightly on the gentle waves. And heading through the meadow, seeing some grazing animals in the meadow, heading through the forest, hearing those birds in the forest. And after many hours of gently canoeing along, and occasionally just drifting along while eating some food in the canoe, and just letting the current take that canoe along, noticing that it's approaching sunset, and so pulling in at the shore in the forest, leaving the canoe, pulling the canoe up onto the shore, securing the canoe in place, clearing some low branches from an area of trees, and attaching a tent up within the trees, between a number of the trunks, climbing a little rope ladder into that tent, and relaxing, settling down in that tent as the night sets in, listening to the changes to the animals, the birds in the forest, from the daytime birds to the nighttime sounds. And the next day, leaving her tent, packing everything away, continuing to canoe through the forest, setting off early for a long day ahead, coming out the other side of the forest and continuing on to a local town. And at the local town, Michelle checks into a small hotel. She freshens up, lies back on a restful bed, feeling the comfort of this bed over where she slept through her journey. And the next day, after having the most wonderful night's sleep, she begins to really analyze those photos. And she was aware that it seemed like it was a map of the stars in the sky, or at least of some very specific stars in the sky. And she was aware that it seemed like the map was showing the location of a distant civilization, and how that distant civilization's location related to other locations in space as seen from the earth. And she wondered to herself whether it would be possible to astral travel to that location and see what is there. And she had astral travelled many times before, but most of those times were to different locations on Earth. Although one of her times astral travelling was to her standing on the moon, experiencing the peace and quiet and the awe while watching the earth rise in the sky. But she had never tried to astral travel any further than this. For her to be able to astral travel to anywhere, she needs to know the place. She needs to be able to have an idea of the location in her mind. She doesn't have to know exactly what the location looks like, but she has to be able to tell herself the location she's aiming for and have a representation of it and an idea of where that location is. Even if consciously she wouldn't be able to work that out fully. And it's only by being able to picture in her mind's eye the location that she wants to travel to, that she can then drift out of her body and travel through space to that place. And so she gets an idea of what that star looks like in the night sky. She gets an idea of where the star is in space by looking at the photos of that crystal cube. And she can see that there's a little dot next to the star she's aiming for, that she assumes is the planet she needs to aim for. So she lies down on her bed, breathes in and out, focusing on that location, focusing on that tiny little dot next to that star, breathing in and out. And as she continues to focus on that tiny little dot, breathing in and out, she feels herself drifting, floating, relaxing deeper and deeper inside. She then begins to count back as she counts herself into that astral realm from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, deeper and deeper, 2, 1, as she leaves her body, and she can feel herself leaving her body, feeling a very slight tingling and seeing a slight glow around her body, and noticing a golden thread attached between her back and her body, and knowing that no matter how far she goes, there's always that golden thread attaching with where she is and her body lying here. And she finds herself then rising up from the bed, rising up through the ceiling, through the roof of the hotel, rising up higher and higher, rising up into space, before then shooting at a high speed in the direction of that star. Almost like all the other stars around her are shooting past her as she travels faster and faster through space, before abruptly slowing down as she approaches the planet, beginning to lower down to that planet. And she can see, as she begins to lower down to the planet, locations on this planet that show that there's an advanced civilization here. And she suspects this is the ancient alien civilization that perhaps visited Earth. And on that planet, she observed different creatures. She noticed the way sound was slightly different here. The sun appeared redder and dimmer in the sky here. Plants appeared taller, with broader leaves. And the intelligent beings here also appeared to be taller and narrower, with pale, almost white skin. And although she couldn't understand what any of the beings were saying, she was able to psychically understand concepts of what they were communicating. And so she settled down in a location, crossed her legs, closed her eyes, and sent out a psychic projection around the planet to try to connect with and find someone who would know about Earth and the temple, about Earth and that temple palace that she'd visited. And while she allowed her psychic projection to touch the minds of all the different beings on this planet, so she could hear the different voices, the different inner worlds of the beings. And she found a group of beings which she identified as knowing about Earth. And so she astral travelled to those beings. And they were in a building, so she headed into that building and was surprised when one of the beings seemed to notice her. And the being called her over in her own language. And she was confused as an astral projection, as just travelling on the astral plane, that they would be able to see her. And she was confused how they would know her language. And the being explained that they can detect energy fluctuations, and her presence created a pocket of energy. And they explained that they're the keeper of knowledge, that they can psychically detect the language of others, and they can communicate in those languages. And this keeper of knowledge shared the story of the stone wheel, of that palace to the god Jupiter, and how humans started worshipping the god Jupiter, because when they arrived on Earth, they happened to arrive when Jupiter was at the heart of a cross formed by the planets in the night sky, as seen from the Earth, and that the wormhole that they had created and travelled through opened and closed right where Jupiter was situated from their perspective. And so those ancient humans gave this significance, this broadening of Jupiter in the night sky, a flash of light, and then a large craft coming from that flash of light at the heart of that cross, and that flash fading away to just Jupiter being in that location. And they explained that they'd arrived to explore life on Earth, and in return for observing humans for a period of time and other life on Earth, and how the technology was developing, how culture was developing, they shared some of their basic knowledge, including creating some devices which they positioned around the planet. And these devices were designed to last. They were made from stone and crystals, and the devices would store the knowledge of their visit to the planet and where they came from, with the expectation that, just like they had done where they went through a stage of eventually becoming spacefaring civilization, humans would likely advance over time, and they will have been looking to the stars, and they will eventually want to reach out to the stars, and they'll become spacefaring themselves, and they'll be curious about whether there's any other life out there. And at that time, they'll have the means to be able to identify a civilization to communicate with and connect with, so that they don't feel alone on their endeavour. And the being took Michelle to a large chamber, called up the records of their visit to Earth, and suddenly, all around them, around the room, was filled with what seemed like a 3D hologram of the events as recorded by these beings. And they were able to fast forward through events, see different bits and pieces, like searching through media files, but seeing it play out all around them, almost as real life. And the whole time they watched these records playing out around them, the being continued to talk about what they had learned, about where else they had been, other knowledge they had gained, and what bits of that knowledge they can share. And Michelle began to get this feeling like she needs to travel back to her body. She's been out of her body, a long way from her body, for a long time. And so she ends the conversations with these beings, aware that she can astral travel to them at any point, and they agree that they're happy to communicate and share information, and they want to know what things are like on Earth now, how things have progressed, where it looks like things are progressing. And she travels back through space into herself lying in that bed before gently opening her eyes. And after opening her eyes, she feels a slight lightheadedness from her experience and feels the need to go outside and get some fresh air. So she leaves the hotel during the afternoon sun, feeling the warmth of that sun on her face, with that chill in the air. She walks around the town. She heads down to the river. She sits gently by the river for a while, placing her feet just in that cold running water, allowing the water to flow gently across her feet, listening to the bubbling of the water as it passes by, the slight lapping of that water on the shore. And then after a while of breathing in some of that fresh, cool air, feeling so calm, so relaxed, so peaceful, she heads back to the hotel, eats an evening meal, and then heads to bed and drifts and floats, so peacefully, so comfortably asleep. And the next day she is finally heading home. And after breakfast, she packs everything away, leaves the hotel, heads to the nearest train station, makes the long journey home by train and by plane, then a taxi to her front door. And during her journey, she takes the opportunity to begin to write her latest book about her experiences, about the knowledge from the gods. And she writes about the journey to the palace, about her time repairing that wheel, about her discoveries, her astral travelling, about her conversations with that alien race. And once home, she sorts out all of her items from her trip. And that evening, heads to bed, drifting and floating so peacefully, so comfortably asleep. And while she drifts and floats so peacefully, so comfortably asleep, so she drifts asleep thinking about her experiences and how she plans to share those experiences in her book, and plans to astral travel to that planet a number more times to interview and gain more knowledge for herself and to include in her book. And she doesn't know for sure whether people will believe what they read in her book, but she knows it's true. And so she wants to share that knowledge with the world. And with that thought in her mind, she drifts and floats so peacefully, so comfortably asleep.